Hi, I'm Cynthia Cheng Correia, co-founder of the Decision Collaborative,
And I'm August Jackson, co-founder of the Decision Collaborative.
and we're here today to talk about polycrisis.
Yeah, this is a really exciting and timely topic. We'll be having a conversation in three parts. And for starters, defining what a polycrisis is, because this might be a term that's new to some of the people who are watching this or listening to this. Then we're going to talk about a polycrisis example that we all lived through in recent years, and that's the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh
So
no, flashback.
you get to look forward to that. Absolutely. And then because this is a decision collaborative, we're going to end this trilogy by talking about what polycrisis means for decision makers and for the people who support them.
Absolutely. And I think as we dive into this, it's important for us to understand that the idea of the polycrisis or the elements of the polycrisis is nothing new. And for those of you who do understand what this is, you've probably been also tuned into the debate, right, of whether or not it's a thing or it's not a thing. And the way I like to see it is that it's not that a polycrisis is new per se. It's really more that it is a new-ish term, right? It's been around for at least a couple of decades, and depending on sort of which sources you read, in terms of its actual origin. But it just suffice to say that these elements have already been in place. There have been very complex situations that have existed. The various kinds of situations that are maybe global, interconnected, super amplified, complex for sure, right? And that they're also very difficult to understand. Right? So those are some of the highlights of what characterizes polycrisis. And and certainly we've all lived through this generationally. World War II, right? Certainly, it
Hmm,
could be
great
considered
example.
that as well, right? As well as various types of global developments. So many people who have been focusing on various types of analysis that are very large in scope, you're already familiar with it. It's just that we have a new-ish term that helps us refine our thinking. And I think that for me anyway, it's a very, very useful one. And I hope that we can illustrate that today in our conversation, and in the series, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, as a bit of an ontologist, one of the things I always think of is, okay, we're talking about polycrisis in this term. What differentiates this from a regular old crisis, or maybe even a really big crisis? And what are the attributes of it that differentiate it? And one of the things that really makes polycrisis stand out from maybe some of those traditional issues of volatility and uncertainty are things like this: the simultaneity and the interaction of crises across multiple domains. So thinking about something that might maybe has an economic element, a political element, and an environmental element, each potentially with their own causal factors, and then also with really interesting sort of interplays among these crises when they're happening at the same time.
Yeah, and they amplify one another
Yes,
too,
yeah.
to the point where the way I tend to visualize this, right, is it becomes almost like tendrils, right, that kind of become interwoven. And
Mm,
so it does pose a lot of challenges to wrapping our heads around this, right? And to be able to tease out elements that we should be paying attention to,
mm.
perhaps we could even do something about, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I like that phrase, wrapping your heads around this, because another interesting aspect or attribute of the polycrisis is that it spans domains beyond the expertise of any one expert. I love the framing of expertise as, or an expert as, somebody who knows more and more about less and less,
Yeah.
because that certainly feels like the modern world that we're living in. And a polycrisis requires deep expertise across multiple domains, such that any decision maker or any decision support person really needs to be tapping into a broad cross-functional organization, getting insights from people from multiple domains, as opposed to simply thinking I'm the expert, I'm the genius, I can keep track of all of this. It's beyond the ken really of any person to be able to track these things at the level of expertise necessary to anticipate, adapt, respond.
Absolutely. And I think that that's really important for professionals, who, managers, leaders who are trying to understand how to approach polycrisis, but also how they can begin to put together tools, right? Not just the teams. Because when we're talking about having multiple types of expertise, it's not even as if you're assembling, say, for example, experts who are, just kind of bringing in their particular domain, right? So say, for example, bringing in, just kind of bringing silos together, right? It's really important that we actually cross-cut. So when we're putting together teams, putting together various types of tools and approaches, it's not even just about ensuring that you have somebody from domain A, domain B, domain C, and so forth, but that when you start to cross-cut and you start to intersect, you get actually this kind of a hybrid approach to understanding the problem that goes beyond just the domain expertise itself. So it's almost as if you have where it's like a multi-Venn diagram, right?
Yeah.
All the areas of intersections come up with their own perspectives, right? The cross-cutting, the cross-functional, intersectional perspective, as opposed to even just the specific perspectives, of the various domains. And I think that's really important to index on, because if we are, say, for example, as managers, and we pull together a team of experts and we just consult them independent of one another, we're still not necessarily capturing the full scope of what we need to understand about this. And so when we bring together groups of multiple experts and have them discussing, it's at these intersections that we get more interesting outcomes as well. And I'm kind of getting ahead of us a little bit, because it's part of this recommendations that we'll provide later on. But I think that also helps with the definition. As we start to think about how we define this, it's very important that we don't silo our thinking, even in terms of the expertise, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate that framing of doing more than simply collecting a set of experts on these themes as well, because one of the interesting dynamics of a polycrisis is that your answer or your solution to one aspect of a polycrisis may actually exacerbate another. And I want to give credit where credit is due to that. That comes from our professional colleague, Parmalee Eastman. I had the opportunity to be on a webinar with her and a couple of our other professional peers from the world of competitive intelligence recently, and she brought up that point. And I might be jumping ahead a little bit to episode 2, where we're going to talk about COVID-19. But this is such a quintessential example of where, if you looked at that polycrisis as a public health risk or a public health crisis, everybody stay home, everybody wear a mask if you go outside for even a minute, and you really pull the lever on locking down this respiratory contagion. Well, how do people respond to that politically? What does that do to the economy? The more you crack down on the health aspect, and if you really go whole hog on solving the health risk, well, then nobody's manning the stores, nobody's doing that essential work, nobody's walking their dogs, those sorts of things, and then also in the political environment of the moment, people are probably losing their minds, politically and socially as well. So, the idea of, taking it back and connecting the dots back to your point about the experts, if you were just collecting the economic expert and the health expert, and the political expert, the health expert would say, well, you've got to, you got to lock people in their houses and blah, 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 and the political expert would know, hey, that's going to have a really bad outcome in most political settings, and the economic expert would know, hey, you're going to destroy the GDP. So what is the conversation among those experts in their areas and their domains of expertise? And like so many things that I think about with respect to decision making, you really have to think about that in the context of opportunity cost, and also the trade-offs, because every decision is ultimately a collection of those two aspects that you need to consider as well.
Absolutely. And then certainly we'll be doing deeper dives on those in future conversations as well. And I do want to pick up on you know your when as you talked about COVID, as you talked about, you just sort of expanded on the idea of tapping into experts. I think one of the things that is so important to our approach with decision collaborative too is recognizing the psychological aspects, right? Not just of the decisions
Mm-hmm.
themselves, but just the way we approach problems. And so I think that that is huge when we're talking about polycrisis, because I think one of the barriers to it is that it's not just a discretely, DISCRETE, right, defined problem that we can study and understand and then come up with a series of prescriptions. Um, the sheer complexity of this means that inherently it creates a barrier to the way we see these problems or can't see these problems,
Mm.
right? I think that we underappreciate as we talk about polycrisis. Certainly you and I have tapped into this world. We pay attention to the various experts, right? From those at polycrisis.org to the World Economic Forum and various academics. And I think that we don't pay enough attention. And certainly people do, right? They pay attention, but not enough attention to the cognitive barriers
Mm-hmm.
that prevent us from appreciating it, seeing it, appreciating it, and then being able to approach tackling it. So ahead of talking about some of the solutions and examples and so forth, I think it's really important for us to recognize this at the outset as we even talk about what polycrisis is, because when we're talking about the cognitive barriers, the sheer scope of a polycrisis, right? The complexity of it, it is global, it crosses industry and multiple domains. So that in of itself, understanding, for anybody who pays attention to behavioral economics or just cognitive science, people can easily get overwhelmed, right?
Mm.
Too many inputs, and the brain just shuts down, really. And so we just tend to want to find more simplicity, right, in the face of the complexity. And so that's one thing that as we are grappling with the definition of polycrisis and trying to understand how we can approach these polycrisis problems and finding solutions, is to understand too our inherent barriers to this, to just being able to approach it. Then there's also the time factor, where when something is further afield, our cognitively, we have a harder time understanding the significance to us. We need generally something more immediate for us to react to. So that also tends to prevent us from wrapping our minds around polycrisis, I think, as accurately. And then also, and then tied to that is the proximity of the impact. Right? How does it affect me? So if we're talking, and climate change is a great example of this, where a lot of people really don't recognize climate change until they've had a catastrophic incident in their vicinity, right? Or something that matters to them, something that impacts their supply chain or something. So these are also other elements too, that as we pay attention to different experts in various domains, it's also really important for us to understand the various types of cognitive barriers, biases, right, in the people who are contributing to our understanding, and then also in ourselves as we are receiving those inputs, right? And then how we might want to put together our own teams that, can understand the problem, but also start to put together various ways that we can be more resilient towards those problems.
That's a really great framing too, thinking about the cognitive barriers, the biases, and then also the psychological factors that go into being able to think about and evaluate a polycrisis, and to consider the implications of a potential or impending or a polycrisis in motion as
Yeah.
well. And could certainly share some more stories there, from the heights of the COVID-19 pandemic in particular, where did some scenario analysis work, did not really have the, let's say, psychological permission within the organization to present some of the challenges that seemed pretty clear even relatively early on in that pandemic. And as a consequence, some of the benefits of the decisions that could have been made at that time really didn't happen because, in my case, the stakeholders hadn't been appropriately primed. Now,
Mm.
we'll get into the taxonomy of black swan and gray rhinos and what have you, and a fun exchange there. Whether or not in the moment I had the time, I'm making an excuse for myself, whether or not in the moment I had the time to create that psychological safety in the moment of what was this quite literally oh shit moment, did what I could. But to say that for decision support, people in decision support roles now, that is something to think about, is how do you lay the foundation for that based on those psychological and cognitive barriers, and also the cultural barriers of whether or not you have the permission, in light of, hey, by the time you need this permission in the moment, it might be too late.
I love this. I love that you are now combining not just the cognitive barriers, but also that time dimension, right? Where there are certain types of polycrisis that are just kind of slower boils, right? Where the frog in the pot. Then there are those, that are more immediate, right? So anything that's like, COVID, we'll talk more about this too, whether or not it's like, oh, is it a gray rhino, a black swan? But whatever it is, it's accelerated.
Yes.
And so in the face of that acceleration, when you have people who have these cognitive blocks, whether or not it's in us, right? We have to be humble to this too, right? As well as our stakeholders, in which some things are just taboo, right? We can't even talk about this, even though we all know it's really important. When you have something that's rapidly accelerating or rapidly evolving, that puts a finer point on things. But that also means that it's putting more pressure on the cognitive load, right? Because the scope is already a problem. It's, we have a hard time focusing on what's going on or what could be happening and what's emerging and so far, and where we could land. But now we're also doing in the face of all kinds of incoming.
Yep.
And so it's really important for us, as we approach polycrisis and trying to understand polycrisis and how we can work with it within this, is to know what we're up against, right? And so I think your mention of time is tremendously important, because it's the type of thing that it sneaks up on us, right? We know this is important, but we don't know that something like this can actually be a barrier to our solutions too.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. So I think this is a good point to talk about. We brought it up, these terms, black swan and gray rhino. What exactly is a black swan?
Yeah. Well, so I think, simply speaking, and, there was, the book, Taleb's book on it too.
Yep.
So let's, give, credit where it's due, where, it's just defined as something that is just unforeseen, right? And significant catastrophic event. So, and this is where it gets really interesting, because I think for a lot of people, say, for example, 9/11, right, was described by a lot of people as a black swan event. It was like, hey, who could have foreseen this? COVID, by many people, was also seen as a black swan. But a lot of people can kind of redefine that and said, no, it's actually more of a gray rhino. Big impact, right? But it's not black. It's not kind of in this black box where we can't see it. It's not murky. We could see it coming. It was making noise. People were warning about it. And so I think that, I don't want to get too much into the weeds of where we should categorize this, because I think that just like with polycrisis, people end up debating definitions rather than focusing on what we can do. So I think that for our purpose, I think that it's helpful for us to understand too that there's a matter of perspective. So for a lot of experts, COVID and even 9/11 were actually gray rhinos, right? In many ways, because they saw it coming. They were foretelling this. They were saying, hey, look, something's like this is coming. We need to be prepared. But for the general population and most of the media, it wasn't something they were indexing on. So for them, it was a shock. For them, it was something that was really surprising. And so I think that it's important for us in terms of practitioners, right? Decision practitioners, intel practitioners, and so forth, to, I think, as we're framing this, to, again, understanding the cognition of the people we're talking about, the stakeholders, and various other folks, that, okay, we can get into the debate, between the two things, but importantly, we have to see things from the perspective of the stakeholders that we're working with, and then approach it from there, right? So I don't mean to get too murky about that, but I think when we're approaching the discussion between, hey, is it, foreseeable, is it not foreseeable, is it kind of in between, like a gray rhino, I think for us, if we're constantly vigilant and picking up on signals, there are rarely any true black swans. We're always picking up signals, right, that could point out some black rhinos, hopefully, before it takes off.
Well, I like that framing that you had with it really does depend on the context of the stakeholder, and that ultimately is the determining factor of whether or not, if you think you would respond to a black swan differently from how you would respond to or prepare for a gray rhino situation or scenario, that sort of mindset of the stakeholder being front and center, particularly for anybody in the decision support role, so competitive intelligence, strategy, market intelligence, those sorts of roles, to recognize that if you're centering that perspective, that that is probably the most helpful orientation to have. And you've got two really fantastic examples, and a couple more I would throw on, the 2008 financial crisis and the collapse of the Soviet Union being two other great examples of, oh, these are black swan moments. And some people will say, well, no, they're, gray rhinos. There are people, relatively prominent within the CIA saying, like, hey, the system's not sustainable, post
Yeah.
Chernobyl, things are falling apart, the
Yeah.
wheels are off the wagon here. And then we've, most of us have seen The Big Short by this point too. So there were people predicting 2008 as well. So then I think we've landed in a place even better than I thought we could, based on your point about the perspective of the stakeholder. Where are they relative to those gray rhinos that the intelligence analyst or the decision support person or the foresight person, the strategy person is out there seeing and observing? And then how do we build the appropriate elements of anti-fragility, if we want to frame it that way, into our organizational decision making to accommodate for what we may perceive as a gray rhino, but our stakeholders may regard as a black swan when it emerges?
Exactly. We can't pay attention to everything. And this goes back to our discussion about experts, right? So that we are keyed into every signal, right? On, various major events. And this is why it's so important for us, to have systems in place that will allow us to do that, and systems meaning not just technology, right? There's got to be the human element as well, these, human experts, in place. And that goes back to what we were saying, we can't even keep them siloed, because it's really the intersection of those humans, the various experts too, that we get that deeper insight, so that we can understand the the sort of cross-sectionality and what may even happen due to that cross-section. If we think about COVID, that actually is really a product of a cross-section, right? When you have a zoonotic, disease hopping over, and whether or not, there's a discussion of a lab or whatever, being involved and so forth. And then we add layers of complexity with people traveling and wet markets and so on and so forth, right? It stops becoming something that resides in the domain of even just epidemiologists, right? We're now talking about sociologists and anthropologists and psychologists who have, who should have roles to play, and various people in public policy and so forth earlier. And so, and it's really through that collective, right, that we can, I think, better anticipate and find solutions, because then we're more keyed into some of the signals that fall out of our respective domains. We can pay attention to the signals that's in our lane, but sometimes those signals are actually coming from elsewhere too. And so if that's not really within our scope, then that's a blind spot. right?
Yeah.
From the perspective of, being able to key into, whatever gray rhinos are lurking out there.